Before the night settles fully, we take a quiet step into the ancient world. Here, the echoes of Alexander's ambition and Rome's vast legacy gently intertwine. Let these calm reflections guide you into a peaceful drift toward sleep. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from all corners of the world. In the soft drift of late evening, when the last fragments of daylight fade from the sky and the world becomes a gentler place, history begins to breathe differently. The noise that usually fills its pages quiets down, and instead of battles and trumpets and triumphs carved in stone, we begin to hear something else entirely. We hear the faint hum of connection, the way one life touches another across centuries, and the way empires, even long after they crumble, continue whispering to each other through the corridors of time. Tonight we follow one of those whispers. A whisper that begins with a boy from Macedon and ends in the heart of Rome, in a massive stone amphitheater that rose long after he was gone. At first glance their stories do not meet. They belong to different worlds, separated by hundreds of years, different cultures, different landscapes, different destinies. Yet if you listen softly, the way you listen to the quiet creak of old buildings at night, you realize that history is full of long shadows, and some shadows stretch farther than anyone expected. To understand this, we return to the beginning. Not the beginning of Rome, nor the beginning of empire, but the beginning of Alexander, the young prince shaped by a world that believed greatness was something you could learn, sharpen, and chase until the end of the earth. He was born in a palace but raised in an environment where education was not a privilege but a destiny. His father, King Philip, forged Macedon into a military powerhouse. His mother, Olympias, filled his imagination with dreams of divine heritage. And Aristotle, the philosopher who guided him, taught him that the world was a place where ideas and cultures deserved to meet, not to remain isolated. These elements blended into a single force inside young Alexander, ambition mixed with curiosity, discipline fueled by imagination, and a burning need to see what lay beyond the borders others accepted as limits. When he became king, he took these parts of himself and turned them into momentum. Cities fell, kingdoms surrendered, and the ancient world trembled as he marched across it with a confidence that seemed almost unreal. His journey carved a path from Macedon to Egypt, where he founded a city that would become a beacon of knowledge, to Persia, where he broke dynasties older than his own lineage, to Bactria, where he met cultures unlike anything he had known, and into India, where his soldiers were so exhausted by the distance and intensity of their march that they begged him to turn back. Alexander's empire stretched from the Mediterranean to the edges of the known world. It was vast, diverse, unpredictable, and filled with people, traditions, and stories that blended together under his rule. Yet while Alexander strode across continents, reshaping the very concept of empire, Rome was still a republic, a state defined not by global ambition but by discipline, strategy, and fierce civic pride. Rome was strong, yes, but it was still gathering itself, still learning how to direct its growing power. And even though the two figures, Rome and Alexander, did not meet in battle or alliance, Rome watched him. Rome listened. Rome learned. Stories of Alexander's campaigns reached Roman ears long before the Republic became an empire. Merchants spoke of him as if he were a force of nature. General after general studied his tactics, trying to understand how someone so young could be so unstoppable. Philosophers analyzed his decisions. Politicians debated whether Rome could ever rival what this Macedonian had achieved in such a short life. The admiration grew slowly but steadily. And admiration, in Rome, was never passive. Rome admired to imitate. Rome imitated to surpass. That was the Roman way. As decades turned into centuries, the influence of Alexander's life seeped deeper into Roman identity. Julius Caesar measured his own achievements against Alexander's and found himself wanting at the same age. Augustus looked to Alexander as a model of imperial presence. Trajan saw in him the blueprint for expansion. Hadrian saw the ideal of blending cultures under one rule. Even emperors filled with cruelty, like Caracalla, shaped themselves after Alexander, copying his dress, his hair, even his manner of standing in portraits. Alexander had been dead for generations, yet in Rome, he lived more vividly than many rulers of their own time. And then came the Colosseum, a monument that rose not from one man's ambition, but from the collective pride of an empire at its peak. When it opened its gates, Rome was no longer a republic chasing greatness. It was greatness embodied. The Colosseum stood as a statement Rome could build on a scale unlike anything the world had ever seen. And in that confidence, in that certainty, something of Alexander's legacy was present. Not in the stones or the architecture, but in the mindset that believed the world itself could be conquered, reshaped, and presented to the people as a gift of imperial identity. Alexander never saw Rome. Rome never saw Alexander. Yet in the calm of night, when the grandeur fades and only the essence remains, their stories feel intertwined. The Colosseum was built in a world that Alexander had helped shape, consciously or not. His campaigns altered trade routes, aligned cultures, fused artistic styles, influenced political structures, and opened lands that Rome later absorbed into its own vast domain. And so, when you stand in the Colosseum today, you are not standing in the world of Rome alone. You are standing in a world altered by a Macedonian king whose life sent ripples across continents, ripples that touched Rome long after he was gone. This chapter is the beginning of their shared echo. And yet, even this is only the beginning of the quiet thread that runs between Alexander's lifetime and the world that would one day construct the Colosseum. For while the stones of Rome's greatest amphitheater had not yet been quarried, and while the Roman Empire had not yet learned the full measure of its own strength, the seeds of connection were already planted, almost invisibly, in the shifting soil of ancient history. Imagine the ancient world as a vast tapestry stretched across continents. Each empire, each kingdom, each city-state weaves its own patterns into the fabric. But some threads pass through many hands, threads that outlive their original weavers. Alexander's influence was such a thread. His empire did not survive him intact, but the impact of his conquests, the cultural blending he initiated, and the fame he carved into the imagination of nations did not fade when the borders of his realm dissolved. They spread. They lingered. They shaped the world that came after him, including Rome. As Rome expanded through the Mediterranean, it encountered the remnants of Alexander's world everywhere. Greek language in Egyptian streets, Greek philosophy in Eastern courts, Greek art in palaces from Syria to Asia Minor. Cities he founded thrived long after his death, each one becoming a beacon of Hellenistic culture. Alexandria, in particular, became a hub of knowledge, its scholars studying mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and history in ways that influenced Roman thinkers for centuries. In this sense, Alexander was a silent architect of the world Rome would later claim. His conquests opened doors, Rome walked through them. His generals attempted to govern diverse peoples, Rome perfected the administration of multicultural territories. His dream of blending cultures laid the foundation for the cosmopolitan world Rome would later command with its legions, senators, and emperors. So even though Alexander and the Colosseum belonged to different chapters of history, there was an invisible line connecting them, a line woven through ideas, people, memories, and ambitions that traveled from east to west, from Macedon to Rome, from a young king's restless vision to an empire's monumental expression. The Romans themselves were acutely aware of this inheritance. As they conquered the lands once ruled by Alexander's successors, they encountered statues of him, libraries filled with scrolls about him, temples dedicated to him, and cities named after him. The Romans did not tear these down. They did not erase his memory. They admired it. They preserved it. They studied it. Because to them, greatness was not a rival to be destroyed, it was a model to be learned from. This admiration became more than academic. It seeped into the aspirations of Roman leaders. Many emperors privately compared themselves to Alexander, wondering whether they could ever achieve a legacy that would echo centuries into the future. Some believed they could. Others believed they should. And a few believed that they had a duty to continue what Alexander began. By the time the Colosseum emerged as the grand centerpiece of Rome's identity, Alexander had become more than a reference, he had become part of Rome's cultural inheritance. His name symbolized the ideal conqueror. His life symbolized the reach of ambition. His legend symbolized what it meant to change the world not through slow evolution, but through bold, sweeping strokes that redrew maps and rewrote the boundaries of possibility. This mindset was alive in the Rome that built the Colosseum. The amphitheater was a demonstration of Roman confidence, but it was also a reflection of a world shaped by centuries of expansion, cultural exchange, and inherited dreams. Alexander's influence was not found in the architecture itself but in the Roman belief that their empire was the culmination of everything that came before it. To build something as enduring and imposing as the Colosseum, one had to first believe that Rome stood at the pinnacle of civilization, a belief formed partly through the shadow of Alexander's example. And so, when we imagine the Colosseum rising stone by stone, we are not imagining an isolated achievement of Roman engineering. We are imagining a structure born from layers of history, ambition, and inspiration drawn from distant lands and older legends. In its arches and corridors, in its vast arenas and echoing chambers, the Colosseum contains not only the story of Rome but the remnants of stories that came long before. In this quiet moment, as we let the pieces settle into place, the connection between Alexander and the Colosseum becomes clearer. It is not a connection formed through direct involvement, but through influence, admiration, and inherited dreams that stretched across time. A young king's vision of a world without boundaries helped shape the world that would one day cheer beneath the towering arches of Rome's greatest monument. And as we drift deeper into this story, it becomes easier to see how history's echoes meet across centuries, forming patterns that reveal themselves only when we listen closely enough. As night deepens and the world settles into its quietest hours, history begins to reveal the layers beneath its surface. Every empire that rises is built upon the remnants of those that came before, and every age carries the memory of older worlds. The faint echoes that once connected a young Macedonian king to a developing Roman identity now lead us deeper into the space where their legacies quietly overlap. Here, the connection grows clearer, not through battles or monuments, but through the movement of ideas, cultures, and ambitions that traveled across continents long before the Colosseum ever took shape. To understand this world, we must first picture the Mediterranean not as a collection of nations, but as a single, vast, shimmering stage. Around its edges lived dozens of cultures: Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Syrians, Carthaginians, Thracians, Jews, Macedonians, each contributing its own stories, languages, and philosophies to a shared environment. It was a world constantly in motion. Trade ships glided across the sea. Caravans moved like slow rivers along desert routes. Scholars traveled between cities. Soldiers marched in patterns that reshaped borders again and again. In this world, Alexander's conquests created a shockwave that did not simply redraw maps, it set off a transformation that touched everything from language and religion to art and science. After his death, his empire fractured into several Hellenistic kingdoms, but the cultural fusion he sparked continued spreading outward, reaching lands he had never touched. Greek became the international language of learning and diplomacy. Hellenistic cities became crossroads of ideas. Sculptures blended Greek forms with Eastern influences. Philosophers explored questions that had never been asked before. Scientists made discoveries that would later become foundations for Roman engineering and medicine. Rome stepped into this environment slowly, almost cautiously at first. They were conquerors, yes, but they were also collectors, learners, and admirers. When Roman armies marched into Greece, they did not destroy its libraries, they absorbed them. When Roman senators studied philosophy, they turned to Greek masters. When Roman artists sculpted their heroes, they borrowed Greek techniques. Even Roman mythology was slowly reshaped by Greek stories retold in new forms. This adoption was not weakness. It was Rome's greatest strength. While other societies clung to their own traditions, Rome welcomed the achievements of others and used them as building blocks for something new. Unknowingly or not, they built much of their world on foundations Alexander had set into motion. The Roman Republic became the Roman Empire in a world where Hellenistic culture was the dominant force. Eastern cities flourished under Roman rule because they were already thriving under Greek influence. Roman law spread through territories where Greek customs had already begun softening old divisions. Roman architecture expanded across lands where Hellenistic aesthetics had already taken root. So when we say Rome inherited Alexander's world, we mean it literally. Rome stepped into a cultural landscape that Alexander had transformed, making the empire's expansion smoother, faster, and more cohesive than it would have been otherwise. Even the very concept of empire, one ruler presiding over countless peoples, was something Rome absorbed from the world Alexander shaped. Before him, most rulers governed smaller domains or loose coalitions of people with similar backgrounds. But Alexander envisioned a world where thousands of cultures could exist under a single authority without losing their identity. Rome perfected that model. They built roads and aqueducts where Alexander had marched. They established provinces in lands his generals once governed. They learned to organize diverse populations the way his successors had tried to. And through all of this, Alexander's name continued drifting through Roman consciousness. His life became a symbol of what a single individual could achieve when ambition aligned with opportunity. His story became a mirror in which Rome could measure its own progress. His legend became a challenge that Rome quietly felt compelled to answer. Caesar carried his writings. Pompey invoked his strategies. Mark Antony dressed as Dionysus because Alexander had associated himself with the same god. Even emperors generations later still whispered his name when they wondered whether their own achievements would be remembered. It is often said that Rome conquered Greece with its legions, but Greece conquered Rome with its culture. That culture, in turn, was shaped by Alexander's whirlwind march across continents. And so, unintentionally but undeniably, Alexander became part of the DNA of Rome itself. By the time the Colosseum rose above the city, Rome had become the greatest inheritor of the world Alexander helped create. The amphitheater's design, its scale, its confidence all spoke of an empire that had absorbed centuries of influence from lands both west and east. Its arches echoed architectural principles refined in the Greek world. Its cultural significance reflected the blending of traditions that Alexander initiated. Even the games held inside were influenced by a long history of Mediterranean spectacle, much of which had been reshaped by the cultural fusion of the Hellenistic age. And so, in this soft moment of reflection, as the lines between history's ages blur, it becomes clear that Rome was not an isolated marvel. It was the culmination of waves set in motion long before its own rise. Waves that began with a young king from Macedon whose footsteps rippled across continents and stirred the world into a new shape. A world Rome inherited, a world Rome expanded, and a world Rome eventually celebrated through monuments like the Colosseum. This is the world behind the stone. The world beneath the arches. The world that connects Alexander and Rome not through time, but through influence. As we drift further into this unfolding story, the world around Rome becomes clearer, like a dim landscape slowly gaining shape in the soft glow of dawn. The Mediterranean, with all its restless trade routes and shifting alliances, was not simply a region of scattered nations. It was an interconnected web of cultures whose ideas flowed more freely than their borders suggested. And in this vast network, Rome's rise was neither accidental nor isolated. It was made possible by the momentum of ages, by the groundwork laid by earlier civilizations, and by the expansive transformation set in motion by Alexander's astonishing conquests. The Romans themselves recognized this more deeply than they liked to admit. On the surface, they projected an aura of self-made greatness, the image of an empire forged through discipline, grit, and the relentless march of their legions. But beneath this proud exterior, they understood something crucial, that the world they dominated had been softened, shaped, and partially unified by forces long before their time. They inherited not a fractured, unfamiliar landscape, but one already integrating into shared languages, shared customs, and shared intellectual traditions. This was the world Alexander helped create. When Rome absorbed Greece, it absorbed the intellectual bloodstream of the Hellenistic world. Schools of thought founded in Athens, Alexandria, and Pergamon influenced the Roman elite. Doctors trained in the tradition of Hippocrates treated Roman soldiers and senators. Engineers who studied in Hellenistic academies advised Roman architects. Even Rome's legal and political thinking evolved under the silent guidance of Greek philosophy. Slowly, the Roman identity became a blend of native Roman discipline and adopted Greek enlightenment, forming a hybrid culture capable of shaping the ancient world in ways neither Greece nor Macedon could have achieved alone. This blending of civilizations made Rome a natural successor to the world Alexander had envisioned. He dreamed of unity across borders. Rome enforced it. He encouraged cultural exchange. Rome institutionalized it. His empire fractured under the weight of its own speed, while Rome, learning from the struggles of the Hellenistic kingdoms, built the administrative systems capable of sustaining a far larger dominion. Roads, aqueducts, provincial laws, census systems, and the vast communication networks that stitched together Rome's lands were all innovations developed in a world where diversity was no longer seen as an obstacle but as an inevitable part of empire. In the Roman mind, Alexander represented both a warning and an inspiration. A warning because his empire collapsed almost as quickly as it rose, teaching Rome that ambition without structure would crumble. An inspiration because he demonstrated how far a unified vision could reach. Roman rulers studied him not because they wanted to mimic his every action, but because they wanted to understand the essence of his influence, the willingness to embrace new ideas, the courage to reshape the world, the belief that greatness required stepping beyond the familiar. As Rome absorbed more of the Eastern Mediterranean, the presence of Alexander's legacy grew even more palpable. Cities founded by him or renamed in his honor pulsed with activity under Roman rule. Alexandria in Egypt became one of the crown jewels of the empire, famous for its scholars and its enormous library. Antioch, Seleucia, Pergamon, and dozens of other Hellenistic cities thrived as commercial and cultural hubs, feeding Rome with goods, knowledge, and skilled minds. Rome's empire was not built solely on military conquest, it was built on a world already interconnected through Hellenistic influence. This interconnectedness made the Roman Empire feel, in many ways, like a continuation of a story Alexander had begun. The Romans did not say this aloud. Their pride would not allow it. But the reflection lingered in quiet moments, in the private thoughts of generals and emperors who knew history well enough to recognize the patterns beneath their own achievements. By the time the Colosseum rose over the Roman landscape, the empire had reached a level of confidence that bordered on mythic. The construction of such an immense structure required not only wealth and engineering, but a belief in the empire's own permanence. And that belief had been shaped by centuries of interaction with the world Alexander once swept across. The diversity of the empire's population, the spread of Greek-inspired arts, the sophisticated philosophies that influenced Roman thinkers, all of these traces pointed back to the transformative era of Hellenistic expansion. Even the audiences who filled the Colosseum carried within them the legacy of the world Alexander shaped. People from Syria, Egypt, Greece, Judea, Asia Minor, Gaul, Hispania, and North Africa all mingled in the vast heart of Rome. They spoke different languages, practiced different customs, and worshipped different gods, yet they shared the same imperial identity. This blending was not something Rome invented but something Rome inherited. A cultural mosaic born long before the foundations of the Colosseum were laid. And in the quiet presence of night, when the crowds fade and the echoes soften, it becomes easier to see how these layers of influence built upon one another. How Alexander's restless ambition created a world where Rome could rise. How Rome's strength allowed that world to flourish. And how the Colosseum, standing tall in the center of an empire that spanned continents, became a symbol of a legacy that stretched far beyond Roman borders or Roman time. The connection between Alexander and Rome was not written in stone. It was written in ideas, in migrations, in shared histories, and in the gradual shaping of a world that became increasingly interconnected. And though Alexander never walked through Rome or gazed upon the Colosseum, a part of his influence lingered in the very air that swept through its corridors, in the distant lands from which its spectators traveled, and in the cultural heartbeat that pulsed beneath its grand design. This is how ancient stories intertwine, not through direct encounters, but through the deep currents that pull one era into the next, weaving them together into a tapestry that only reveals its full pattern when viewed from far above, with time itself as the lamp that lights the way. As the ancient world continues to unfold before us, the connections between distant eras begin to feel less like coincidences and more like gentle currents guiding one age into the next. The Mediterranean landscape was never still. It moved with the rhythm of ideas carried by travelers, soldiers, merchants, and scholars. And in this constant motion, Rome's rise was shaped not only by its own ambitions but by the echoes of a world it quietly absorbed. To understand how deeply this influence reached, imagine the daily life of Rome during its ascent. Streets filled with voices speaking Latin, Greek, Aramaic, Egyptian, and dozens of dialects. Markets overflowing with spices from Arabia, silk from the East, grain from Egypt, and finely carved goods inspired by Greek artistry. Temples dedicated to Roman gods standing side by side with shrines influenced by Eastern beliefs. The empire was not a single culture, it was a grand mosaic held together by a shared sense of order and identity. That mosaic traced its first outlines in a world transformed by Alexander's conquests. Rome's elite understood this better than anyone. When they sought education for their sons, they hired Greek tutors. When they wished to appear cultured, they quoted Greek philosophers. When they wanted to appear worldly, they spoke in Greek, the language of diplomacy and intellectual prestige. The heroes and myths of Greece became the foundation of Roman literature and art. Even the grand Roman villas were decorated with Greek-style mosaics and modeled after Greek architectural principles. This blending was not simply admiration, it was practical. Rome was building something larger than a city or a state. It was building a new version of the world, one capable of holding many nations together. And the blueprint for such a world had already been tested in the lands Alexander once swept through. His successors struggled to balance diversity within their territories, learning through trial and error what worked and what shattered under pressure. Rome studied these examples carefully, adopting what succeeded and discarding what failed. In doing so, it built an administrative machine capable of sustaining a vast empire for centuries. But beneath these structural influences lay something more subtle, a shift in how Rome saw itself. In the earlier days of the Republic, Rome's goals were limited. Expand into Italy, secure trade routes, defend its borders, maintain the stability of its citizens. But as Rome absorbed the culturally rich and philosophically advanced regions of the Hellenistic world, its ambitions evolved. It began to see itself not just as a dominant power, but as the rightful heir to a wider destiny. Conquering territories was no longer enough. Rome believed it was meant to rule the world in a manner worthy of the civilizations that came before it. And this belief, whether spoken or unspoken, was one of Alexander's greatest gifts to those who followed his path. The Romans knew they were walking through land scarred by his campaigns, studying texts written by those who had witnessed his empire firsthand. In Alexandria, scholars preserved the knowledge of centuries, storing it in a library so vast that it became a beacon of the ancient world. Roman officials walked its halls, learning from texts that came from every corner of Alexander's former realm. They read about astronomy from Babylonia, mathematics from Greece, medicine from Egypt, histories from Persia, and philosophies born in cities that no longer existed. This knowledge shaped the way Rome approached governance, trade, science, and the arts. Even the concept of universal history, one narrative that tied together the stories of all peoples, was a Hellenistic idea that Rome embraced. Before Alexander, most societies wrote only of themselves. After him, the idea of a shared human story began to take shape. Rome adopted this mentality wholeheartedly, believing that its fate was intertwined with the fate of the world, that its triumphs and struggles were part of a larger human journey. This was the mindset that made Rome not only expand but unify, not only conquer but integrate. And in the quiet spaces of Roman thought, another realization lingered, that greatness was not measured only by the lands one held or the armies one commanded, but by the legacy one left behind. This idea, too, was shaped by the memory of a young king who had burned across history like a comet. Alexander died at 32, yet his name endured for centuries. Rome understood this deeply. Its emperors built monuments not merely to show power, but to show permanence, to carve their presence into the memory of future generations. This desire for an enduring legacy can be felt most strongly in the great stone structures that defined Rome's skyline. Each one was a declaration of identity. The forums, the temples, the baths, the palaces, all symbols of an empire determined to be remembered. And among them, nothing exemplified this more than the vast amphitheater that would later be known as the Colosseum. The Colosseum was not built to honor a god or a ruler. It was built to honor Rome itself, to show the world what the empire had become, to offer spectacles that united people of every background in a shared experience of awe. But to build something of that scale, one needed more than engineering. One needed belief in empire, in destiny, in a legacy that deserved to stand for millennia. That belief was shaped by many things, but among them was the quiet, enduring influence of Alexander's vision of a world that stretched beyond borders, a world where people from distant lands could gather under a single idea of greatness. As history drifts forward in these soft hours, the thread linking these ancient worlds becomes harder to ignore. Rome did not rise alone. It rose from the momentum of centuries and from the echoes of a king whose dream reached farther than any before him. And in the glow of torchlight flickering against stone, the connection between these seemingly distant ages begins to feel not only possible but inevitable. As the ancient world continues to reveal itself in these gentle hours, the story widens like a landscape coming into focus. The more closely we look, the clearer it becomes that Rome's destiny was shaped not only by its own resilience, but by the profound transformations of the Mediterranean long before Roman banners reached their height. And among these transformations, the wave set into motion by Alexander carried farther than anyone living in his age could have imagined. Life across the empire reflected this inheritance in countless subtle ways. In the bustling markets of Rome, vendors sold goods from lands Alexander had once walked through: ivory from Africa, incense from Arabia, textiles from the East, spices from distant regions once linked by his campaigns. Roman households adorned their walls with paintings influenced by Greek styles. Wealthy citizens commissioned statues in the idealized forms pioneered in the Hellenistic period. Even the layout of Roman villas echoed architectural concepts found in the cities Alexander's successors had built. Everywhere Rome looked, it saw remnants of a cultural fusion it had not created, but absorbed and perfected. This absorption was not limited to the visible world. It also shaped the inner world of Roman thought. The writings of Greek historians, dramatists, and philosophers filled Roman libraries. Stoicism, which became one of the most influential belief systems in Rome, was itself born in a Hellenistic city, developed in an environment that existed because of Alexander's empire. Roman senators debated ideas drawn from academies that stood on foundations laid during the Hellenistic age. Even the scientific achievements of Rome, from architecture to medicine, were built upon theories first explored by scholars living in the wake of Alexander's conquests. This inheritance created a quiet sense of continuity between the two civilizations. It was as if Rome was finishing a story the Hellenistic world had begun. Not rewriting it, not ignoring it, but extending it toward a grander vision, one that reached from the Atlantic shores of Hispania to the deserts of Arabia, from the forests of Gaul to the mountains of Armenia. The scale of this ambition was unprecedented, yet it grew naturally from the world the Romans learned from, and that world was profoundly shaped by the currents Alexander had stirred. In this expanding world, the identity of Rome grew more complex. Romans were proud of their traditions, their discipline, their law, their military. But the more they interacted with the Eastern Mediterranean, the more they understood that greatness required more than force. It required knowledge, diplomacy, art, philosophy, and the ability to inspire people from vastly different backgrounds to see themselves under the same banner. This idea of an empire not made of one people but of many was something the Romans refined, but Alexander had demonstrated first. The Roman imagination began to stretch beyond the Italian peninsula. They no longer thought of themselves merely as conquerors, but as stewards of a global identity, a civilization meant to outlast the ages. Their architecture grew more ambitious. Their political systems more elaborate. Their understanding of their own place in the world deepened. And in this quiet transformation, the legacy of the Hellenistic age lived on, feeding an inner certainty that Rome was destined for something enduring. As the generations passed, this growing identity solidified. The eastern provinces of the empire became centers of wealth, knowledge, and influence. Cities founded during the Hellenistic era remained vibrant under Roman rule, often more prosperous than cities in Italy itself. Antioch became a cultural jewel. Alexandria stood as the intellectual heart of the empire. Pergamon, Ephesus, Seleucia, and countless others pulsed with life, each one contributing to Rome's sense of being more than a regional power. These were cities Alexander's world had shaped, and now they were pillars of Rome's strength. And then came the era when Rome, confident and unchallenged, began to build monuments not merely for function, but for legacy. Stone was no longer just stone, it was a declaration. Marble was not simply decoration, it was identity. And the amphitheater that would one day be known as the Colosseum was the clearest example of this newfound Roman confidence. It was constructed not only as a place for entertainment, but as a demonstration of what the empire believed itself to be: unified, powerful, eternal. But such confidence does not come from nowhere. It is built over centuries of accumulated influence, inherited wisdom, absorbed cultures, and philosophical evolution. It comes from seeing the world not just as something to control, but as something to represent. And within that belief rested the faint but undeniable echo of Alexander's vision of a world brought together under one vast idea, a world where borders blurred, where identities mingled, and where people could stand together in the heart of an empire and feel part of something larger than themselves. The people who filled the Colosseum reflected this idea. Citizens from cities Alexander had conquered. Merchants from regions his armies had traveled through. Scholars whose work was born from schools founded in the wake of his campaigns. Even the gladiators, many of whom came from lands once touched by the Hellenistic world, stood in an arena powered by the cultural current set in motion centuries before. In this vast amphitheater, filled with the voices of thousands, built upon the confidence of an empire, and shaped by layers of influence, the ancient Mediterranean came full circle. Rome was not simply showing the world its strength. It was showing the culmination of everything it had inherited. The legacy of Persia, Egypt, Greece, Macedon, and dozens of other cultures flowed into the heartbeat of Rome. And intertwined with those currents was the lingering presence of a young king whose vision of unity had changed the very structure of the ancient world. It is within this quiet continuity that the connection becomes undeniable. Not a connection through time or direct influence, but through the deeper tides of history, tides that carry the dreams of one age into the achievements of another, binding them in ways that no single lifetime could fully comprehend. And as we move forward through this unfolding narrative, the traces of this shared legacy grow ever clearer, revealing how the ambitions of one man helped frame the destiny of an empire that would define the ancient world. As the ancient world stretches further behind us, the connection between distant eras becomes even more layered, like ripples spreading across a still body of water long after the first stone has fallen. In these quiet reflections, the Mediterranean no longer feels like a region divided by borders, kings, or armies. It becomes a great, interconnected organism, breathing through the exchange of ideas, art, and ambition. And in this organism, the influence of earlier ages continues to pulse long after their empires have faded from sight. Rome, in its ascent, moved through a landscape steeped in memory. It was a world shaped by centuries of exchanges between East and West, by civilizations that had risen and fallen, by cultures that had blended on the edges of trade routes. The Romans walked through lands layered with history, lands where Alexander's footsteps had stirred the soil, where Greek philosophy had taken root, where Persian traditions endured even after dynasties changed, where Egyptian knowledge flowed into libraries filled with scholars from across the ancient world. Each region Rome touched was a doorway into a deeper legacy. In Egypt, the Romans encountered a society older than any they had known, one that had been transformed by Alexander's arrival and carried forward by the Ptolemaic dynasty. In Syria, they found bustling urban centers shaped by Greek language and Eastern customs, places where merchants conducted business in a world more cosmopolitan than anything Rome had yet seen. In Asia Minor, they inherited cities that blended Greek architecture with Persian influences, forming a rich tapestry of styles and ideas. As Rome extended its reach across this vast territory, it absorbed not just political control but the wisdom, traditions, and identities of dozens of civilizations. This absorption was not always peaceful, nor always fair, but it was constant. Rome did not conquer in isolation. It conquered within a world that had already been stirred into motion by the Hellenistic age, and whose currents continued flowing through the fabric of everyday life. In these regions, the influence of Greek culture was unmistakable. Streets named after philosophers. Market squares adorned with statues of heroes. Theatres echoing with tragedies and comedies written centuries earlier. Schools teaching mathematics, geometry, and medicine. Libraries holding scrolls from across the known world. And behind this cultural web stood the legacy of Alexander, whose conquests had spread Greek thought like seeds scattered by the wind. Rome, though powerful, was humble before the intellectual achievements of the Greek world. Its statesmen quoted Greek plays. Its generals studied Greek tactics. Its young elites traveled east for education. Even the emperors, men whose word could reshape the world, were influenced by Greek ideals of leadership, heroism, and philosophy. In this sense, the Hellenistic world did not become Roman. Rome became Hellenistic. This transformation touched every part of Roman life. The city of Rome itself changed. New buildings reflected Greek styles. Public speeches referenced Greek rhetoric. Religious practices incorporated gods and rituals adopted from distant lands. Roman poetry, once simple and direct, became layered with Greek metaphors and imagery. Even the Roman understanding of beauty shifted toward Greek ideals of symmetry, balance, and proportion. Through all of this, the memory of Alexander persisted like a faint melody woven into the background of Roman imagination. He remained the symbol of boundless ambition, the embodiment of youthful greatness. His image appeared in Roman homes, in art, in literature, and in the private thoughts of leaders who dared to compare their own achievements with his. Though he had been dead for centuries, his presence felt alive, an invisible challenger urging Rome to push further, reach higher, and carve its own definition of empire. And as Rome embraced this broader identity, a question began to take shape in its collective consciousness: what does it mean to rule the world? To control land so vast that the sun seems always to rise over one province as it sets over another? To maintain unity across distances that once seemed impossible? To govern people whose cultures, languages, and beliefs differed in every imaginable way? It was a question Alexander had confronted during his campaigns, struggling to unite soldiers from Macedon with subjects from Persia, India, and Egypt. His dream had been a world without walls, a world bound together by shared purpose rather than divided by old hostility. Rome inherited this dream, imperfectly, unevenly, but undeniably. Its emperors, knowingly or not, walked a path shaped by a man who believed the world could be more connected than anyone had previously imagined. This belief took physical form in the Roman world. Roads stretched across mountains and deserts. Trade routes linked distant provinces. Aqueducts carried water across vast distances. Law standardized life across the empire. And in the heart of Rome, monumental architecture reflected a confidence born from centuries of inherited influence. Among these monuments, the amphitheater that would one day be known as the Colosseum stood as the most iconic. Its construction required not only resources and manpower but a philosophical certainty that Rome was a civilization worthy of creating something eternal. And while the Colosseum represented Roman engineering and political might, it also embodied the cosmopolitan spirit inherited from the world Alexander helped weave together. The people who filled its seats were proof of this. They came from lands that had once formed the backbone of the Hellenistic kingdoms. They carried languages shaped by Greek influence. They lived in communities molded by Macedonian and Eastern traditions. In every cheer, in every gathering, in every spectacle, the legacy of a much older world breathed through the Roman present. This blending of civilizations became Rome's greatest strength. It created a society capable of absorbing the wisdom of others while forging its own distinct identity. It allowed Rome to stand not only as a military giant but as a cultural heir to centuries of human thought. And deep within this cultural inheritance, the echo of Alexander persisted, subtle, distant, yet undeniably present. As we drift further through history's quiet corridors, the connection strengthens. The Mediterranean is not a region of separate stories. It is a single narrative, shaped by countless hands. And within this narrative, Alexander's restless pursuit of unity and Rome's towering ambition to define the ancient world exist not as isolated events, but as interconnected threads woven into the same enduring tapestry. As we follow this deepening current through the ancient world, the picture widens even more, revealing the intricate web of influences that shaped Rome's identity long before its empire reached its peak. Each passing century added new layers to this transformation, like brushstrokes on an enormous canvas that stretched across oceans and deserts, mountains and plains. And in this expanding canvas, the spirit of connection became just as important as the power of conquest. Rome's greatness, often celebrated in marble inscriptions and written in the confident tone of imperial records, had roots far older than the city itself. Every triumph Rome achieved was built upon the foundations of earlier civilizations that passed down knowledge through art, architecture, philosophy, religion, governance, and scientific discovery. These contributions flowed into Rome like tributaries feeding a vast river, enriching its culture and shaping its worldview. The eastern provinces offered Rome more than wealth or strategic territory. They offered perspective. In the bustling ports of Alexandria, Rome encountered a society where scholars debated astronomy, where mathematicians worked on theories that would influence architecture for centuries, where musicians blended rhythms from Africa and the Near East, and where thousands of scrolls preserved the knowledge of civilizations long forgotten. These voices echoed through the Roman world, influencing not only the minds of scholars but the decisions of its leaders. Farther east, Rome encountered traditions shaped by the Persian empires, traditions of governance, postal systems, administrative structure, and cultural tolerance. Though Rome considered itself the superior force, it absorbed many of these methods into its own imperial model. Tributes were organized in ways reminiscent of Persian practices. Military logistics evolved from earlier Eastern strategies. Even the idea of an emperor whose authority extended beyond national identity reflected the influence of older Eastern monarchies, some of which Alexander had conquered, others he had admired. In the Mediterranean islands and along the coasts of Asia Minor, Rome inherited the artistic sophistication of the Greeks. Sculptors captured human emotion in stone with a realism Rome eagerly adopted. Architects developed principles that made structures feel balanced, harmonious, and eternal. Poets wrote verses exploring the fragility of life, the power of fate, and the complexities of the gods. Rome did not discard these ideas, it embraced them, reinterpreted them, and solidified them into cultural norms that would endure for centuries. Even in regions like Judea, Armenia, and Arabia, each with its own complex history, Rome encountered philosophical and spiritual traditions that shaped the empire's understanding of morality, justice, and human values. The Roman world was not a uniform entity, it was a mosaic that expanded with every new culture it encountered. And at the center of this mosaic lay the faint but unbroken thread of Alexander's vision, a world where no border was too sacred to cross, where people from distant lands could live under a shared structure, however imperfectly. This thread extended even into the military structure of the Roman Empire. Early Roman legions were strict, disciplined, and based on a citizen-soldier model. But as the empire grew, Rome learned to recruit and train soldiers from distant provinces, echoing the diverse armies that Alexander had once assembled. These soldiers brought with them unique fighting styles, traditions, and skills that reshaped the Roman military into a more adaptable force. The idea that people from different backgrounds could work together under a single command was not new. Alexander had proven its potential. Rome simply perfected the model. As centuries passed, the Roman understanding of power evolved beyond simple domination. Power became a story, one Rome wanted to tell with greater eloquence, greater grandeur, and greater scale. And nothing told this story more effectively than the monumental architecture that dotted the empire. These structures were not built merely for utility. They were built to communicate identity. Amphitheaters, aqueducts, triumphal arches, temples, and basilicas were expressions of Rome's belief that it was not just a political entity, but the pinnacle of human civilization. And these structures combined engineering knowledge from Egypt, mathematical advancements from Greece, artistic principles from the Hellenistic world, and architectural concepts inherited from cultures stretching across Asia Minor and beyond. The amphitheater that would later be known as the Colosseum was the embodiment of this synthesis. It was not simply a building, it was a declaration in stone that Rome had taken the wisdom of the ancient world and forged it into something bold, unified, and unmistakably its own. Its scale was unprecedented. Its design was innovative. Its purpose was deeply cultural. It stood at the intersection of entertainment, politics, engineering, and identity. When spectators filled its massive tiers, they represented the empire itself, diverse, complex, bound together by a shared structure that reached across continents. In the roar of the crowd, one could hear not only Roman pride but the echoes of civilizations that had come before. The languages spoken in its corridors carried accents shaped by centuries of migration, conquest, and exchange. The performers in its arena came from lands that had once been touched by the Hellenistic world. Even the concept of public spectacle, mass gatherings that reflected the empire's identity, had deep roots in Mediterranean traditions shaped during the centuries after Alexander's rise. All of these influences converged in ways subtle to the casual observer but unmistakable in the broader sweep of history. Rome was not isolated in its greatness. It was the heir to a long sequence of interconnected worlds, a sequence that passed through Macedon, Persia, Egypt, and Greece. A sequence woven by philosophers, merchants, generals, poets, and dreamers whose ideas transcended the boundaries of their lifetimes. And at the beginning of this long inheritance stood a young king from Macedon whose restless ambition stirred the ancient world into motion. His dream of a world connected by culture rather than divided by rivalry may not have succeeded in his own lifetime, but its influence endured, shaping the lands Rome would one day claim, the people it would govern, and the monuments it would build as symbols of an empire that embraced the legacy of ages. In the quiet flow of these ancient connections, the Mediterranean becomes a single, unified narrative. And as the shadows of history stretch from one era into another, the shared heartbeat of these civilizations reveals itself, not as a collection of isolated achievements, but as a continuous story formed by the ambitions, beliefs, and traditions of countless lives intertwined across time. As we drift deeper into the ancient world, the transformation of Rome becomes less a story of conquest and more a story of inheritance. Civilizations do not rise in isolation, they grow from the soil enriched by those that came before. And in Rome's case, the roots reached far beyond the Italian peninsula, stretching across seas, deserts, mountains, and the vast territories once shaken by the footsteps of Alexander. With each generation, Rome absorbed not only land but wisdom, absorbing the echoes of old worlds and breathing new life into them. By the time the Roman Empire reached its golden age, its identity had become a grand mosaic of traditions layered over centuries. The bustling streets of Rome revealed this with every step. One could walk from a temple influenced by Eastern designs to a bathhouse inspired by Greek principles, past statues carved with Hellenistic realism, toward a marketplace carrying goods from lands Alexander once traversed. Romans lived in the center of a world that extended far beyond their own history, and although they celebrated their native traditions, they could not deny the footprints of the cultures intertwined with their own. The empire's cities reflected this blend magnificently. In Corinth, one might hear the soft rhythm of Greek poetry recited in a courtyard shaded by imported palm trees. In Ansch, the scent of spices from Arabia drifted through colonnaded streets built by Roman engineers yet decorated with Greek mosaics. In Alexandria, scholars debated philosophies that combined Egyptian mysticism with Greek logic and Eastern astronomy, creating ideas that would one day shape Roman law, literature, and political theory. Each city breathed differently, yet all were connected by Rome's vast administrative system. This vastness was both Rome's strength and its greatest challenge. Governing such diversity required more than force, it required understanding. And in this regard, Rome was fortunate. The Hellenistic world, shaped by Alexander's broad vision, had already tested the viability of multicultural governance. His attempts to blend Persian, Egyptian, Indian, and Greek traditions into a shared reality, however imperfectly executed, introduced the ancient world to the idea that unity did not require uniformity. Rome watched, learned, improved, and turned this idea into an imperial philosophy. The Roman legions, too, embodied this evolution. Once reliant on citizens of Rome itself, the army gradually opened its ranks to men from distant provinces. Soldiers from Gaul marched beside recruits from Syria. Auxiliary units from North Africa fought alongside archers from Crete, cavalry from Thrace, and engineers from Anatolia. This diversity was not a sign of desperation. It was a sign of sophistication. Rome had learned that a world-spanning empire required a world-spanning army. Alexander had attempted something similar, integrating Persians and Macedonians into a single fighting force. Rome simply refined the method into a system that endured for centuries. This blending extended into Roman leadership as well. Emperors increasingly looked eastward for inspiration. Some embraced Greek philosophy as a guide for ethical governance. Others adopted Eastern religious ideas to solidify divine legitimacy. The empire's intellectual elite often came from regions with deep Hellenistic foundations. Physicians from Alexandria became personal advisors to emperors. Astronomers from Asia Minor calculated celestial movements that influenced Roman calendars. Jurists trained in Hellenistic logic shaped Roman law, the same law that would later influence Europe for 2,000 years. The influence of the Hellenistic age even touched Rome's understanding of fate and human destiny. Philosophies such as Stoicism and Epicureanism became deeply embedded in Roman culture. These schools of thought, born in cities shaped by Alexander's conquests, taught Romans how to navigate the pressures of power, the weight of ambition, and the unpredictable rhythms of life. Generals marching across continents carried these ideas with them. Statesmen confronting political turmoil consulted them. Emperors facing the burdens of leadership embraced them for solace. And through all these transformations, the idea of legacy grew ever more significant. Rome wanted to be remembered. Not simply for its victories, but for its grandeur, its culture, its contributions to the story of humanity. To achieve such permanence, Rome turned to monumental architecture. Buildings rose not merely as functional structures but as symbolic declarations of identity, destiny, and power. temples reached skyward as if carved from the heavens. Forums expanded like open-air palaces designed to impress citizens and foreigners alike. And aqueducts, stretching for miles, demonstrated Rome's mastery over nature itself. The amphitheater that would later be known as the Colosseum was the ultimate manifestation of this desire, a structure built not to honor a single ruler, but to honor the empire as a whole. It was an architectural triumph that fused Roman engineering with aesthetic influences borrowed from older civilizations. Its arches echoed Greek mathematical harmony. Its scale mirrored Eastern conceptions of royal grandeur. Its purpose reflected the Mediterranean tradition of communal spectacle, where people from countless backgrounds gathered under one roof to experience a shared moment. Inside its walls, the diversity of the empire became visible in a single glance. Citizens from Hispania sat beside merchants from Syria. Families from Gaul shared the excitement of the arena with travelers from Egypt. Gladiators came from every corner of the empire, each carrying the history of their homeland into the heart of Rome. The amphitheater became a microcosm of the world Alexander once dreamed of, a world where borders blurred and people stood together in a shared experience of wonder, excitement, and unity. Even as Rome embraced its expanding identity, it continued to feel the quiet presence of Alexander's legacy. His story had become a point of comparison, a measuring stick for ambition. Roman leaders admired his courage, studied his strategies, and imagined themselves achieving similar feats. Though centuries separated their lifetimes, his influence lingered in their actions, decisions, and dreams. In the stillness of night, when the noise of the crowds faded from the Colosseum's massive corridors, the echoes of older worlds could almost be heard in the stone. The philosophies that shaped Roman thought. The art that defined Roman beauty. The scientific principles that guided Roman engineering. The multicultural essence that sustained Roman identity. All of these threads wove together into a single tapestry that connected Rome to distant ages and forgotten kingdoms. This tapestry, woven from countless cultures, ideas, and histories, was not the work of Rome alone. It was the work of a world constantly reshaped by waves of influence, and one of the most powerful waves had begun with Alexander, whose dream of unity had carried far beyond his lifetime. As the narrative continues to expand, the ancient Mediterranean becomes a living memory, a place where ideas traveled farther than armies, where stories endured longer than monuments, and where the legacies of many civilizations converged to form the world Rome would one day call its own. And as these influences continued weaving themselves into the Roman world, the fabric of the empire grew richer still, expanding beyond anything its founders could have imagined. Each passing generation absorbed new layers of meaning from the civilizations it encountered, allowing Rome to reshape itself again and again. This adaptability was one of the empire's quiet strengths, an ability not just to rule but to listen, observe, reinterpret, and evolve. In the great port cities, where ships arrived daily with goods from beyond the horizon, the atmosphere felt like the heartbeat of a world united by trade and curiosity. Sailors from distant coasts told stories of lands beyond the empire's reach. Eastern merchants brought fabrics dyed in colors rare to Roman eyes. Scholars traveled from one end of the empire to the other, seeking knowledge preserved in temples, academies, and libraries. These journeys created invisible threads of connection, each one adding depth to Rome's understanding of the world it governed. The empire's diversity was not a challenge to its identity, it was essential to it. Rome did not define itself by the exclusion of others but by the absorption of everything it considered valuable. It offered a framework, law, order, infrastructure, unity, and within that framework, the cultures of countless regions expressed themselves freely. This balance between structure and freedom created cities unlike any seen before, cities where Greek sculptors worked alongside Egyptian priests, where Syrian traders negotiated with Iberian farmers, and where ideas flowed more freely than the waters of the Tiber. Even religion transformed under this vast exchange. Roman gods blended with Greek equivalents. Eastern deities found new homes in Roman sanctuaries. Mystery cults from Egypt, Persia, and Anatolia spread through the empire, offering spiritual experiences that resonated with people seeking deeper meaning in an ever-changing world. The Romans did not fear these foreign traditions, they embraced them, recognizing that the spiritual needs of a multicultural society required flexibility. Temples dedicated to multiple pantheons stood side by side, each one reflecting another layer of cultural inheritance. The intellectual world flourished under this openness. Philosophical schools evolved, mixing Greek logic with Roman practicality. Scientific advancements accelerated as knowledge from multiple civilizations converged. Doctors studied Egyptian medical texts alongside Greek theories. Architects borrowed geometric principles developed centuries earlier in Hellenistic academies. Astronomers combined Babylonian calculations with Greek models to refine their understanding of the cosmos. Every discipline became a meeting place of ancient minds whose ideas traveled farther in Rome than they ever had in their own civilizations. This constant exchange shaped the Roman sense of destiny. The empire did not simply see itself as powerful, it saw itself as the vessel through which centuries of human knowledge flowed. It believed it had inherited the responsibility of shaping the world, preserving the past while constructing the future. This belief drove the creation of monuments, laws, literature, and artworks meant to endure as long as human memory survived. Rome built for eternity because it felt it stood at the center of a story larger than itself. The amphitheater that would one day be known as the Colosseum captured this vision perfectly. Its design embodied the blend of cultures that had shaped Rome's identity. Its purpose reflected the Mediterranean tradition of communal gathering. Its structure displayed engineering principles drawn from both Roman innovation and older Greek methods. Its scale demonstrated a confidence inherited from centuries of imperial ambition, not only Rome's ambition but the ambition of earlier civilizations whose dreams had extended across continents. In its corridors, the voices of the empire converged. People spoke languages from every corner of the known world, yet all participated in the same spectacle, united by the moment. The arena became a place where Rome celebrated not just entertainment but the very idea of a world brought together. The roar of the crowd was more than excitement, it was a declaration that the empire's identity was built on the fusion of countless legacies, including those shaped by Alexander's vision of unity. And so, with each passing reflection, the connection between these ancient worlds becomes clearer. Rome did not rise in a vacuum. It rose from the accumulated dreams of civilizations that came before, from the science of Egypt, the philosophy of Greece, the governance of Persia, the myths of countless cultures, and the expansive vision of a young Macedonian king whose footsteps set the Mediterranean into motion. As we drift deeper into this unfolding story, the ancient world becomes a place where borders fade, where ideas converge, and where the legacies of countless empires intertwine to form a single narrative, a narrative that would eventually echo through the arches of Rome's greatest monument and across the ages that followed. As the ancient Mediterranean continues to widen before us, the world becomes less a collection of nations and more a vast, interconnected memory. Every shoreline tells a story, every marketplace reveals a fragment of the past, and every road carries echoes of the footsteps that shaped the civilizations we still study today. Rome, standing at the height of its power, reflected not only its own achievements but the silent influence of countless cultures woven into its identity. To walk through the empire during this era was to experience a living tapestry of ideas. Cities glowed with the energy of countless traditions blending into a single pulse. Greek educators taught Roman youth in villas adorned with Eastern textiles. Merchants from Arabia negotiated prices with traders from Gaul. Priests from Egypt carried sacred rituals into Roman temples, where they mingled with rites borrowed from Greece, Persia, and Anatolia. The empire had become a crossroads of civilization, where no single culture dominated entirely, yet all contributed to the shared experience of Roman life. This fusion was not imposed from above, it unfolded naturally from the momentum of history. The Hellenistic age had already softened boundaries and encouraged connections across vast distances. Alexander's conquests had opened routes that brought people together in ways the ancient world had rarely seen. Rome simply stepped into that reality, expanding it, strengthening it, organizing it into a structure that could endure. In this structure, knowledge flowed like water through an elaborate network of aqueducts. Philosophical debates that once took place in the squares of Athens now unfolded in the forums of Rome. Medical practices developed in Alexandria were taught in Roman academies. Astronomical observations made in Babylon influenced the calendars and agricultural cycles of Roman provinces. The empire became the meeting place of ancient brilliance, preserving ideas that might otherwise have faded into the dust of time. The influence of Eastern religions grew stronger as well. Worshippers of Isis gathered in temples lit by flickering oil lamps. Devotees of Mithras met in subterranean sanctuaries carved beneath bustling Roman streets. Mystical rites brought from Persia, Egypt, and the Levant blended with Roman traditions, offering spiritual paths that resonated with people seeking meaning in an increasingly vast and complex world. Rome, instead of resisting these influences, allowed them to coexist, recognizing that unity did not require uniformity. This tolerance extended into political thought. Roman lawmakers studied the legal traditions of other cultures, adopting and adapting principles that strengthened their own administrative systems. The concept of provincial governance evolved into a sophisticated structure capable of handling disputes, managing resources, and maintaining order across immense territories. Just as Alexander had envisioned a world loosely unified by a shared identity, Rome built a system that turned that vision into a lasting reality. Daily life reflected this unity in subtle ways. In southern Italy, families cooked meals flavored with spices imported from the East. In Spain, Roman-style bathhouses echoed with laughter while decorated with mosaics inspired by Greek myth. In North Africa, bustling markets carried amphorae painted in styles originating in the Aegean. Everywhere, traditions overlapped, creating a cultural language understood across the empire regardless of a person's birthplace. And as Rome expanded physically, it expanded intellectually. Wealthy citizens collected scrolls from distant lands, building private libraries that rivaled public collections. Scholars traveled across provinces to study in regions renowned for specialized knowledge. In Alexandria, mathematicians traced the movements of the stars. In Pergamon, medical scholars dissected human understanding. In Rhodes, philosophers shaped ideas about virtue and freedom. These pursuits flowed into Rome, enriching its intellectual life and guiding the decisions of leaders who sought to rule with wisdom. But beneath this flourishing of culture and knowledge lay another, quieter transformation, Rome's shifting understanding of legacy. The empire no longer aimed only to conquer. It aimed to endure. It recognized that true greatness required more than military victories. It required monuments, laws, philosophies, and structures that could withstand the erosion of time. And so, Rome built boldly, reaching for permanence with every stone. The amphitheater, later known as the Colosseum, became the pinnacle of this ambition. A feat of engineering that stunned the ancient world, it was a visual statement that Rome saw itself as eternal. Its towering arches, symmetrical design, and immense scale spoke of a confidence shaped not only by Roman strength but by inherited inspiration. Greek mathematical principles guided its proportions. Techniques developed in the eastern provinces influenced its decorative style. And the concept of gathering thousands of people in a shared spectacle reflected a Mediterranean tradition shaped by centuries of cultural exchange. Inside the amphitheater, diversity was not an abstraction, it was alive. Spectators wore garments reflecting fashions from distant provinces. Vendors sold foods flavored by regional spices. Guards spoke with accents shaped by foreign homelands. The arena floor itself carried the stories of gladiators from every corner of the empire. Each person who stepped into the colossal structure represented a thread of the wider tapestry from which Rome had been woven. Seen through this lens, the Colosseum was not merely a Roman monument. It was the physical embodiment of a centuries-long journey, beginning in the East with the cultural fusion created by Alexander's campaigns, developing through the Hellenistic age, and culminating in Rome's grand expression of imperial identity. The amphitheater's stones contained the silence of old philosophies, the echoes of ancient cities, the wisdom of distant lands, and the dreams of countless generations seeking something greater than themselves. And although Alexander never set foot in Rome, the essence of the world he transformed drifted through the empire like a distant memory. His legacy persisted not as a portrait in a gallery or a tale in a book, but as a subtle force shaping the systems, ideas, and ambitions of the people who built the Colosseum and the empire around it. In these quiet reflections, the ancient Mediterranean reveals itself as a single, continuous story, one in which the deeds of a Macedonian king helped define the world Rome inherited, expanded, and celebrated through monuments that still stand today. And as the night deepens around this unfolding narrative, the connection between these distant ages becomes ever more clear. Civilizations rise not solely from within, but from the countless legacies carried to them across the currents of time. And as these threads of influence continue to wind their way through the Roman world, they created a cultural landscape so vast and interconnected that it almost seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The empire became more than a political entity, it became a living memory of every civilization it touched. Every new custom adopted, every idea preserved, every structure built became part of a story stretching backward through centuries and outward across continents. Even the simplest moments of daily life reveal the depth of this inheritance. A Roman child learning to read might trace letters shaped by centuries of linguistic evolution, letters standardized by Greek scholars and adapted through generations. A craftsman carving marble in a villa courtyard could unknowingly follow sculpting techniques perfected in Hellenistic workshops long before Rome's rise. A merchant weighing goods in a bustling marketplace used units of measure influenced by older civilizations that had once dominated trade routes stretching from the Mediterranean to the Near East. This silent continuity reached into the social fabric of the empire. Festivals that began as local traditions gradually blended with customs from distant provinces, creating celebrations that reflected the empire's diversity. Music carried rhythms born far beyond Rome's borders. Instruments crafted in Egypt or Syria found their way into Roman ceremonies. Even the spices used in feasts traced their origins to lands shaped by ancient trade networks that Alexander had once set in motion. With every shared experience, Rome's identity grew more expansive. Political life also bore the imprint of this multicultural inheritance. Senators debated issues that affected people across thousands of miles, drawing on philosophies born in Athens, ethical principles explored in Asia Minor, and practical knowledge gathered from every corner of the empire. Rome's laws became a synthesis of ideas, some Roman, some Greek, some Eastern, molded together into a system capable of governing a population more diverse than any the ancient world had known. As time passed, this sense of unity strengthened. people who once thought of themselves through narrow local identities began to see themselves as part of something broader. They were citizens of towns, of regions, of nations, but also citizens of Rome, a concept that held meaning across languages, landscapes, and generations. This shared identity was one of the empire's quiet triumphs, a testament to its ability to absorb and reconcile the countless legacies it inherited. And through all of this, the monumental architecture that defined Rome continued to rise as a visible expression of the empire's evolving soul. In every arch and column, one could see not only Roman innovation but the influence of civilizations long past. The Colosseum, towering over the city with a confidence that defied time, stood as a reminder that Rome was not merely a conqueror of lands but a steward of history. It gathered the essence of the ancient world, ideas, styles, stories, and transformed them into a structure that embodied the grandeur of an era shaped by centuries of interconnected destinies. The amphitheater's immense presence reflected the collective dreams of countless peoples. Its stones had been cut by hands carrying traditions older than Rome. Its foundations rested on knowledge refined in cities shaped by Alexander's legacy. Its arches mirrored principles perfected in Hellenistic academies. And its very purpose, to bring together an empire in shared experience, echoed the ancient idea that unity could be created through common moments, whether of celebration or reflection. Seen in this light, the Colosseum becomes more than a monument. It becomes a vessel holding the echoes of civilizations that once defined the ancient world, and a bridge connecting their legacies to the empire that inherited them. And in the quiet spaces between these echoes, the presence of Alexander's influence lingers gently, shaping the world Rome built and the dreams it carried forward. The deeper we travel into the currents of the ancient world, the more clearly we see that Rome's identity was built not on isolation, but on the constant merging of countless legacies. No single culture shaped the empire; rather, the empire emerged from the slow weaving of ideas, customs, and ambitions drawn from every civilization it encountered. In this vast blending, something remarkable happened. Rome became a reflection of the world it ruled, a mirror that held the memory of lands far beyond its own origins. The empire thrived on movement of people, goods, knowledge, and belief. Roads stretched across valleys and mountains, connecting villages to cities, cities to ports, and ports to distant provinces. Along these roads, merchants carried stories and artifacts from their homelands. Soldiers shared tales from campaigns fought in foreign landscapes. Priests offered rituals influenced by distant gods. Scholars traveled in search of libraries and teachers whose wisdom had survived the centuries. Rome's strength was not only in its armies but in the ceaseless exchange of the world flowing through it. In this exchange, the legacy of the Hellenistic world continued to play a central role. The cities founded or influenced by Alexander remained hubs of culture long after his empire collapsed. Alexandria thrived as a beacon of intellect, its library attracting thinkers from every corner of the Mediterranean. And shone as a crossroads of East and West, blending artistic traditions from Greece, Persia, and beyond. Pergamon, Ephesus, Seleucia, each one carried the imprint of a world reshaped by Alexander's ambition. Rome nurtured these cities, understanding that their value lay not only in their wealth but in their ideas. The empire relied on the brilliance generated in these ancient centers, integrating it into its own cultural and political fabric. Roman elites traveled to them for education. Scientists consulted their scholars. Artists studied their works. Administrators learned from their methods. And ordinary citizens absorbed fragments of their cultures through trade, stories, and everyday interactions. This constant flow of influence shaped Rome's understanding of what it meant to be an empire. The Romans learned that power was not measured solely in territory or military strength, but in the ability to shape the world's memory. They recognized that the most enduring empires were those that preserved the legacies of others rather than erasing them. And so, instead of dismantling the cultural achievements of the Hellenistic world, Rome amplified them, embedding them into a new, broader identity that stretched across continents. In everyday life, this identity revealed itself in countless details. Children learned fables originally told in Greek marketplaces. Philosophers referenced works written centuries before their birth. Builders used principles refined by mathematicians from distant lands. Doctors applied treatments first experimented with in temples far from Rome. Even the fashion of the elite reflected the styles of regions shaped by Alexander's legacy. A Roman household might celebrate a festival rooted in one culture, cook meals flavored by another, and tell stories inherited from yet another, all without recognizing how deeply ancient memory had influenced each moment. In the political sphere, the influence was just as profound. Roman governors relied on administrative practices used by older empires to manage diverse populations. Diplomats negotiated using customs borrowed from Eastern traditions. Emperors considered themselves heirs not just to Rome, but to a lineage of rulers stretching back through Greek kings, Persian monarchs, and Egyptian pharaohs. Their understanding of authority became intertwined with the wisdom of civilizations absorbed into the empire. This blending of identities made the Roman world resilient, adaptable, and sophisticated. It created a society where differences did not fracture the whole but strengthened it. People from different regions could travel freely, find opportunity, gain education, worship in their own ways, and still exist within the shared framework of the empire. This unity had been difficult to imagine in earlier ages, yet by the time Rome reached its peak, it had become an everyday reality. The monumental architecture of the empire symbolized this unity. Buildings rose not just as structures, but as representations of Rome's belief in its destiny. Temples honored gods from many lands. Forums displayed statues influenced by styles from multiple cultures. Theaters performed works written in languages spoken centuries earlier. And in the center of it all, the great amphitheater later known as the Colosseum stood as a declaration of Rome's identity, a place where the empire gathered as one, celebrating its victories, its diversity, and its sense of belonging. Inside the amphitheater, thousands of voices blended into a single roar, carrying with them the echoes of ancient worlds. The games reflected the complexity of the empire, spectacles drawn from Mediterranean traditions, performers from distant regions, and rituals rooted in centuries of shared history. For many, entering the amphitheater must have felt like stepping into the heart of the ancient world itself, where the legacies of countless civilizations were transformed into a single experience. Yet even within this spectacle, subtle reminders of the past lingered. The proportions of the arches followed principles refined in Greek academies. The massive stones reflected engineering knowledge rooted in earlier Eastern traditions. The idea of communal gathering echoed customs practiced in cultures across the Mediterranean. And the multicultural crowd filling the seats embodied the vast inheritance Rome carried, an inheritance shaped, in no small part, by the world Alexander had once set into motion. This connection between distant eras reveals itself not through direct encounters, but through the quiet persistence of influence. Alexander never saw Rome. He never imagined the Colosseum. Yet his ambition reshaped the lands Rome absorbed, the people Rome ruled, and the ideas Rome embraced. His legacy lived in the thoughts of generals, the dreams of emperors, the education of scholars, and the customs of everyday life. And as the ancient world drifts further into memory, it becomes clear that these threads of influence did not fade, they formed the foundation upon which Rome built its identity. The empire became a vessel carrying the dreams of countless civilizations into the future, ensuring that their legacies endured long after their own empires had vanished. In this quiet reflection, the ancient Mediterranean becomes a world without borders, a place where the ambitions of a young Macedonian king and the vision of a vast Roman Empire intertwine, shaping the history that would one day echo through the stones of the Colosseum and the ages that followed. And as these influences lingered in the Roman world, they continued shaping the empire in ways so subtle that even those living in the midst of it rarely noticed how deeply ancient memory guided their lives. Every new generation stepped into a world already shaped by countless others, inheriting traditions without always knowing their origins. In this quiet continuity, the Mediterranean revealed itself not as a series of separate histories but as a single, ongoing dialogue between civilizations. Travelers moving along the empire's roads could sense this continuity in the atmosphere itself. A merchant leaving the ports of Alexandria might recognize familiar customs in the marketplaces of Corinth. A scholar studying in Athens could continue his research seamlessly in Rome. A soldier stationed in Syria might find architectural details in Gaul that reminded him of buildings back home. These familiarities were not coincidences, they were proof of the interconnected world that had been forming for centuries. This shared cultural language made the empire feel both enormous and intimate. No matter how far one traveled, echoes of home were never fully lost. Art styles repeated themselves in distant provinces. Religious symbols resurfaced in unexpected places. Food seasoned with spices from the east tasted familiar even in the westernmost corners of the empire. The Mediterranean had become a world where influence flowed freely, defying the boundaries of geography. Rome understood the value of this shared memory. It nurtured it, expanded it, and used it to unify regions that might otherwise have remained divided. The empire's administrators relied on local knowledge to govern effectively, recognizing that the wisdom of older civilizations had practical value. In many provinces, Rome allowed traditional customs to continue, weaving them into the broader structure of imperial law. This flexibility made the empire adaptable and resilient, capable of absorbing change rather than resisting it. Even the intellectual life of Rome reflected this openness. Philosophers debated ideas that traced their origins across countless generations. Historians preserved records of civilizations long vanished. Mathematicians built upon theories developed in temples and academies hundreds of years earlier. And through all of these disciplines flowed the subtle imprint of Alexander's dream, a world where knowledge traveled farther than armies ever could. This dream manifested most clearly in the sense of unity that permeated the empire. People no longer saw themselves solely as citizens of individual cities or regions. They recognized a broader connection, an identity shaped by shared laws, shared infrastructure, shared experiences, and shared aspirations. This shift in perspective created a new kind of ancient society, one where belonging extended beyond birthplace and bloodline. And in this shared belonging, the monuments of Rome took on a deeper meaning. They were not merely architectural achievements, they were symbols of a collective identity forged through centuries of inherited wisdom. The amphitheater, later known as the Colosseum, captured this identity more completely than any other structure. It was a place where the vastness of the empire became visible in a single gathering, where people of every age, culture, language, and background stood together, united by the experience unfolding before them. For many, entering the great amphitheater felt like stepping into the center of the world. Its massive stone walls seemed to hold the weight of history itself. The crowd's voices blended into a sound that echoed across time, carrying with it fragments of countless civilizations that had shaped the empire's soul. And beneath the spectacle, beneath the noise and the celebration, lay the quiet truth that Rome's greatness was never born from isolation. It was built from the legacies of those who came before, from dreams carried across continents, and from vision sown in centuries past. In this soft reflection, the ancient world feels closer, more connected, more alive. The story unfolding across the Mediterranean was not a series of disconnected episodes but a continuous tapestry woven by countless hands. And the threads connecting Alexander's world to Rome's were not merely illusions of history, they were the very fabric of the empire that would one day stand as one of the greatest civilizations the world had ever known. Say continue when you're ready for Chapter 8, already extended B. As we drift further into the ancient Mediterranean, the story grows wider and deeper, revealing how Rome's greatness was not a sudden explosion of power, but the culmination of countless quiet influences that shaped its identity over centuries. By the time the empire reached its full height, its culture had become a vast reservoir of inherited traditions, ideas, and memories, many of them rooted in lands reshaped long before by Alexander's ambition. Walking through the empire during this era felt like traveling through layers of time. In every province, echoes of older civilizations mingled with Roman presence. In Greece, philosophical schools continued to thrive under Roman rule, filling their halls with students debating questions about virtue, destiny, and the nature of the universe. In Egypt, priests tended temples that had stood for millennia, their rituals influenced by both local traditions and Hellenistic customs introduced during the Ptolemaic dynasty. In the Near East, cities that once formed part of Persian and Macedonian realms pulsed with renewed energy under Roman governance, blending their ancient legacies into the empire's evolving character. This blending was not merely tolerated, it was encouraged. Rome realized early that a diverse empire could not be held together by force alone. It required a shared sense of belonging, a belief that everyone within its borders was part of a grander story. And this story was shaped as much by the philosophies of Athens and the sciences of Alexandria as by the laws of Rome and the traditions of Italy. The empire's openness to cultural exchange created a society in which ideas traveled at remarkable speed. A doctor in Gaul might study medical texts written in Alexandria. A philosopher in Rome might draw inspiration from a teacher in Rhodes. A poet in Asia Minor might imitate styles developed in the theatres of Athens. Knowledge flowed freely across borders, carried by travelers who moved through the empire with an ease unmatched in earlier centuries. This movement created a shared intellectual landscape that tied together the lives of people who had never met, yet spoke a cultural language they all understood. Even traditions that began far from the heart of the empire found new life within Rome. Eastern religious practices rooted in ancient temples blended with Roman rituals, offering spiritual experiences that resonated with people living in a world connected as never before. In hidden sanctuaries beneath Rome's streets, followers of Mithras performed secret rites once practiced in Persia. In temples dedicated to Isis, worshippers chanted hymns originating in Egypt. In household shrines, families combined Roman offerings with traditions passed down from their ancestors. This spiritual diversity became part of the empire's everyday rhythm, revealing how deeply interconnected the ancient world had become. The multicultural essence of the empire extended even to its social structures. Many of Rome's most influential thinkers, artists, and administrators came from provinces shaped by the Hellenistic world. They brought with them skills, perspectives, and traditions that strengthened Rome's ability to govern. The empire did not merely rule over these people, it embraced them as essential contributors to its success. This mindset created a society where a person born in Syria, Spain, Alexandria, or Anatolia could achieve prominence in Rome itself. This openness made the empire remarkably dynamic. Its architecture reflected this dynamism in every corner. Roman engineers built aqueducts using principles refined by earlier civilizations. They designed forums and basilicas influenced by Greek styles. They constructed theaters inspired by traditions from the Eastern Mediterranean. And in the heart of Rome, these influences converged into monumental expressions of imperial identity. Among these expressions, the amphitheater, later known as the Colosseum, stood unparalleled. It was more than a building, it was a declaration of Rome's ability to gather the world under one roof. Its towering arches, carefully calculated proportions, and immense capacity symbolized both the power and the inclusiveness of the empire. The structure felt almost alive, as if the stones themselves carried the memories of the civilizations that shaped them. Inside the amphitheater, the diversity of the empire became a visible, tangible reality. Spectators filled the stands wearing garments from distant regions. Performers from across the empire stepped into the arena, each carrying the history of their homeland. Officials spoke in accents shaped by their provinces. Vendors sold food flavored by spices grown in lands once part of Alexander's dream of unity. Every voice, every gesture, every ritual unfolding beneath the Colosseum's arches reflected the cultural mosaic of the Roman world. This mosaic was not an accident, it was the natural outcome of centuries of intertwined histories. Alexander's conquests had introduced the Mediterranean to a new level of cultural fusion, blending Greek, Persian, Egyptian, and Eastern traditions into a single, expansive network. Rome inherited that network, expanded it, and gave it new life. And although Rome became the dominant force of the ancient world, it never forgot the civilizations that paved the way for its rise. Many Roman leaders saw themselves as the heirs of that earlier world. They studied Alexander's strategies, read the accounts of his campaigns, admired his charisma, and measured their achievements against his. Even those who never admitted it openly felt the weight of his legacy shaping their ambitions. His presence lingered in the empire like a faint guiding star, unseen yet impossible to ignore. And so, as the Roman world continued to evolve, the echoes of Alexander's vision remained deeply embedded in its foundations. The empire's roads connected lands once traversed by his armies. Its languages carried Greek words shaped during the Hellenistic age. Its art reflected motifs developed long before Rome's founding. Its intellectual life thrived on ideas preserved in cities once under his influence. And its monumental architecture, including the Colosseum, embodied the cosmopolitan spirit of a world reshaped by his bold imagination. In these gentle reflections, the Mediterranean becomes a place where time moves in long, overlapping waves. The dreams of one age become the foundations of another. The stories of kings, scholars, traders, and soldiers mingle into a single narrative carried across generations. And the connection between Rome and the world Alexander reshaped becomes not just a historical coincidence, but a testament to how human ambition, once unleashed, can echo across centuries. As we drift forward in this unfolding story, the ancient world begins to feel less like a distant memory and more like a living presence, its influence still rippling across the empires that rose in its wake, its legacies still visible in the monuments that survive, and its dreams still whispering through the corridors of history. As the ancient world continues to unfold in the quiet glow of reflection, the forces that shaped Rome appear less like isolated events and more like the merging of vast, ancient currents. What once seemed like separate civilizations, Greek, Persian, Egyptian, Macedonian, gradually reveal themselves as interconnected pieces of a much larger story. And in this expanding vision, Rome's rise feels less like an unexpected triumph and more like the natural continuation of centuries of cultural exchange, ambition, and human imagination. By the height of the empire, Rome stood at the center of a world that felt astonishingly unified. Not unified by language or tradition, but by the flow of ideas that connected cities across continents. This unity did not erase differences, it celebrated them, weaving them into a cultural landscape richer than any single civilization could have created alone. To understand this world, imagine the great roads stretching across the empire, not just paths for soldiers, travelers, and traders, but arteries carrying the lifeblood of countless traditions. Along these roads, knowledge moved with a freedom unknown in earlier centuries. A teacher from Athens could instruct students in Gaul. A doctor from Alexandria could treat patients in Rome. A sculptor from Asia Minor could leave his mark on villas in Italy. These movements were not anomalies, they were the essence of Roman life. This constant exchange shaped the way the empire understood itself. Rome did not see its provinces as distant territories to be controlled, it saw them as essential parts of a broader identity. The empire was vast, but it was also deeply connected, its people bound together by law, infrastructure, and a shared world shaped by centuries of blended traditions. The influence of the Hellenistic world remained particularly strong. Even long after Alexander's empire dissolved, the cities he transformed continued to generate knowledge that echoed across the Mediterranean. Alexandria remained a center of scientific research, where scholars studied the stars, experimented with mathematics, and catalogued the natural world. And continued to flourish as a meeting place of Eastern and Western art. Pergamon preserved its reputation for medicine and scholarship. And countless other cities retained the intellectual spirit sparked during the Hellenistic age. Rome recognized the value of these centers and protected them, ensuring that their knowledge could travel freely through the empire. This decision created a world where ideas matured as they moved, enriched by each city they passed through. The Romans did not restrict this flow, they encouraged it, understanding that the strength of the empire depended on the wisdom it could gather. This wisdom extended far beyond intellectual pursuits. It shaped everyday life in ways so subtle that people rarely realized how deeply they were influenced by ancient traditions. The foods they ate carried spices from lands shaped by centuries of trade. The music they listened to reflected rhythms from distant regions. The clothing they wore blended styles from Italy, Greece, Egypt, and Syria. Even the stories told in Roman households carried motifs inherited from civilizations long gone. Public life reflected this diversity as well. Festivals blended local customs with empire-wide traditions. Public debates drew upon philosophies from multiple cultures. Artworks combined motifs from various regions, creating styles that felt both familiar and entirely new. Rome did not suppress the traditions of its provinces, it amplified them, allowing each culture to leave its imprint on the empire's identity. Nowhere was this blending more evident than in Rome's architecture. Every major structure, temples, theaters, baths, forums, embodied the empire's diverse roots. Architects drew inspiration from Greek symmetry, Egyptian grandeur, and Eastern decorative styles. Engineers used techniques borrowed from older civilizations to build aqueducts, bridges, and monuments capable of withstanding the march of time. The physical world of Rome was a testament to the empire's willingness to embrace the wisdom it inherited. And in the center of this world, the great amphitheater later known as the Colosseum stood as the ultimate symbol of Rome's identity. Built on a scale that defied imagination, it represented a world united not by conquest alone, but by the shared experiences of its people. Thousands could gather within its walls, speaking different languages, wearing different garments, carrying stories from faraway lands, and yet, in that space, they became part of a single collective moment. The arena was more than entertainment. It was Rome's declaration that it was the rightful inheritor of the ancient world. It was a place where the empire celebrated not only its strength but its diversity. The games reflected traditions from across the Mediterranean. The architecture revealed influences from civilizations Rome admired. And the very concept of gathering vast populations under one roof echoed the ancient idea of unity Alexander had once envisioned. Though Alexander never lived to see the empire Rome would become, the world he reshaped continued to influence its evolution in countless ways. His campaigns had opened routes Rome later used. His cities had preserved knowledge Rome later studied. His vision of blending cultures had shown Rome the value of unity beyond borders. And his legacy had inspired generations of Roman leaders to pursue greatness that reached beyond their own lifetimes. As night settles over this unfolding story, the ancient Mediterranean becomes a place where the past and present intertwine. The dreams of earlier civilizations echo through Roman achievements. The wisdom of long-vanished empires lives on in the monuments of the Roman world. And the connection between Alexander's ambition and Rome's destiny becomes clearer with every reflection. In these gentle moments, the ancient world reveals itself not as a series of isolated civilizations, but as a single, interconnected narrative, one that continues to shape the memory of history and the imagination of all who follow in its footsteps. As we approach the quiet horizon of the ancient world, the story of Rome and the echoes of the civilizations that shaped it begin to blend into a single, expansive reflection. The Mediterranean, once a patchwork of kingdoms and cultures, now feels like one great tapestry woven from thousands of threads spun by countless hands, guided by countless dreams, carried across countless generations. And within this tapestry, the connection between Rome and the legacy of Alexander continues to shimmer with a subtle, timeless clarity. Rome did not rise to greatness alone. It rose by listening to the voices of lands older than itself, to the wisdom of distant peoples, to the memories of empires long vanished. It rose by absorbing the beauty, the knowledge, the imagination, and even the mistakes of those who came before. And in this rising, the world Alexander once transformed provided the foundation upon which Rome built its identity. The influence of the Hellenistic world did not fade with the passing of centuries. It lived on in every corner of Roman society. In the bustling forums where merchants exchanged stories from faraway lands. In the academies where scholars debated questions older than Rome itself. In the temples where worshippers offered prayers shaped by the combined spiritual traditions of many civilizations. And in the countless conversations whispered between families sitting beneath lamplight, discussing philosophies and myths inherited through generations. Travel across the empire revealed this inheritance at every step. In the markets of Ephesus, one could buy Egyptian jewelry crafted with techniques refined long before Rome's founding. In the streets of Ansh, children learned mathematical principles recorded by scholars from Alexandria. In the villas of wealthy Roman families, paintings reflected the artistic ideals of Greece, Persia, and the Near East. And in the public baths of Carthage, people relaxed amid architectural details influenced by tradition spanning from the Aegean to the Euphrates. Rome, both knowingly and unknowingly, became the guardian of the ancient world's memory. It preserved traditions that might have disappeared. It spread knowledge that might have faded. It carried forward stories that might have been lost. And all of this happened because centuries earlier, a young king from Macedon set the world into motion, opening doors that Rome would later walk through with confidence. This continuity becomes especially clear when we look at the empire's greatest monuments. Rome built structures not merely to impress but to endure. These were not temporary achievements, they were statements of identity meant to outlast time. And nowhere was this clearer than in the amphitheater that would one day be called the Colosseum. The Colosseum was the heart of Rome's communal life, a monument where thousands from every corner of the empire gathered in shared experience. Its arches reflected engineering brilliance shaped by centuries of inherited knowledge. Its design balanced symmetry and strength in ways perfected by earlier Greek architects. Its decorations incorporated motifs with roots in Egypt, Asia Minor, and the Near East. It was, in every sense, a structure born from the collective imagination of the ancient world. Inside the Colosseum, the empire revealed its true nature. Spectators from Gaul shared seats with travelers from Arabia. Traders from Hispania sat beside scholars from Alexandria. Gladiators from Thrace fought before Roman nobles, while musicians from Syria filled the air with rhythms carried across deserts and seas. Every face, every voice, every gesture inside the amphitheater embodied the diversity Rome had embraced. The arena was not simply a symbol of entertainment, it was a symbol of unity. A place where differences dissolved into a single moment of shared anticipation, excitement, or awe. It was the physical expression of a world connected not by birth or blood, but by the threads of history that bound its people together. And within this unity, Alexander's legacy lived quietly. Not in statues or inscriptions, but in the cultural fabric of the empire itself. In the languages spoken. In the knowledge preserved. In the roads built along paths first opened by his armies. In the cosmopolitan cities he inspired. And in the idea that the world could be larger, more connected, and more unified than anyone before him had dared to believe. Rome, in its greatest moments, did not forget this. Its poets wrote of distant heroes. Its generals studied the campaigns of the Macedonian king. Its emperors compared their ambitions to his. And its people lived within an empire that had become the culmination of dreams far older than the empire itself. In the stillness of hindsight, the Mediterranean no longer appears divided by centuries or by borders. It becomes a single living story, a story of human ambition, curiosity, and resilience. A story of civilizations rising, influencing one another, and leaving behind legacies that transcend time. A story in which the footsteps of a young king echo through the marble corridors of Rome, shaping the world in ways he never lived to see. And as the narrative drifts toward its closing silence, the connection between these ancient worlds reveals itself not as myth, not as coincidence, but as a gentle truth whispered across the ages. Rome inherited a world shaped by Alexander. Rome expanded that world. Rome preserved it, celebrated it, and carved it into stone so future generations could walk through its doors and feel the heartbeat of history under their feet. The Colosseum, standing tall against the centuries, is more than a Roman masterpiece. It is a monument built from the dreams, knowledge, and stories of countless civilizations, including the one reshaped by a Macedonian king whose vision changed the course of history. In the quiet glow of reflection, these legacies merge into one continuous breath, one endless thread, one sweeping memory of the ancient world, a world where Alexander's ambition and Rome's destiny intertwine, echoing softly across the ages, carried forward by the timeless rhythm of history itself. As we leave the ancient world behind and the echoes of empires fade into the quiet of the night, the stories we've wandered through settle softly into stillness. Rome, Alexander, the civilizations that rose and fell around them, all become distant lights flickering across the vast horizon of history. Their voices grow gentle now, like fading footprints on sand, leaving only their wisdom drifting in the air. And in this calm moment, the journey becomes something simpler. A reminder that the world is shaped not by one life, or one kingdom, or one moment, but by countless dreams carried forward through time. Every stone laid, every idea shared, every culture blended into another, all of it becomes part of the same endless tapestry. So let the weight of these stories rest quietly in your mind. Let the memories of distant ages drift into the background like embers in a dying fire. And as the night deepens, allow yourself to sink into stillness, knowing that history moves slowly, gently, always forward, and you, too, can drift with it into peaceful sleep. Rest well.